joining us. We are doing a video live stream presentation on walking alongside the brokenhearted. My name is Ray Paget. I am the Community Outreach Chaplain for Faith Hospice, and it's my privilege to present this presentation to you this afternoon. One of the things that we'll be talking about is the idea of grief. Most of us have experienced grief. We lost loved ones, we've lost jobs, we lost aspirations. All of these things are part of what we would say the grief process. Walking alongside the brokenhearted, though, will help you as a friend or a relative, even as a spouse, to help you walk alongside someone who is in the throes of grief and bereavement. Also, if you are presently experiencing grief and bereavement, this is also something that you need to hear as well. Because as you'll see, as we go through this presentation, as you'll see the slides, grief and bereavement is a difficult topic for most of us to address. And I think, personally, there are a number of things that we must misunderstand about it. So let me begin by sharing with you what I call my personal experience with grief. We could have that slide, please. Every one of us has what is known as a loss history. And just so you know where I'm coming from, I thought I would share mine with you. My mother died unexpectedly at age 39. I was 15, my oldest sister was 18, and then we had two siblings under the age of 7. My best friend, I grew up outside the Philadelphia area. Our homes were attached. I actually used to talk to my friend through a closet wall. We grew up from being in our mother's wombs till the day he died at age 21. He was drunk, going around the corner and crashed his car. That was a tragedy in my life, and one so personal, in fact, even somewhat a bit more personal than even losing my mother. My grandfather died following alcoholism. He came to a point where he actually had to have a limb taken from him, and eventually he died because of his disease. My grandmother died following a stroke. Now, that is a grief. It is part of my loss history, but it was also, my grandmother was 92 years old and lived a full life. And when sometimes, and you know this yourself, when you have someone who has lived a full life, someone who has experienced all that God could bring into their life in a marvelous way, when they're gone, you could actually rejoice. And I rejoice with my grandmother. My sister-in-law died of a drug overdose. Again, a surprise and a great source of grief for our family. My father was killed by driver negligence. He was actually on his way to work, and he was broadsided in an intersection by a school bus. Fortunately, the school bus was empty of the students, but my father was killed instantly. And my oldest sister died in December of 2019 of lung cancer. Now, I share these things with you only so you understand that we all have a history of losing loved ones, friends. I could put a number of things there. I could talk about losing jobs. I could talk about dashed dreams. All those things are part of loss. Specifically, we're addressing, generally speaking, the loss of a loved one through death or disease. Next slide, please. Grief is not an illness. And here's I think will set the base in regard to what I want to share. And you'll see as we go along the theme that I want us all to understand. Grief is not an illness. It doesn't need to be fixed. It doesn't need to be cured. And grief, unless it's complicated grief, and there is such a thing as complicated grief, it does not have to be treated. But grief should be recognized and addressed compassionately. These are something I think that we need to understand, because I think here's where we come to confusion about grief. Because so oftentimes when we're grieving and our grief process isn't happening fast enough, we're not finding ourselves feeling better, then we automatically think that there's something wrong with us. And so we need to understand that grief is not an illness that you just take a pill for or you go to the doctor to be cured of. It's a process. Sometimes it's a longer process than others, but it is indeed still a process. Next slide, please. When we think about grief, we tend to view grief from a medical perspective. There's observation, there's symptoms, there's the disorder, there's a pathology of it, there's a diagnosis, there's a treatment. And I think, generally speaking, particularly here in the United States, since we're a people who always are trying to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and we're always moving to go ahead and be successful here, be successful there, oftentimes we don't want to have any time for grief. We don't realize that grief is a natural, and I'll say even a necessary thing. So when we're suffering grief and it doesn't fit our timetable, then all of a sudden we think, well, something's wrong with me. And that again brings on a medical perspective. Next slide. Some attempt to treat, and I have that in quotes, the bereaved as a patient. So people don't all grieve the same. Now, maybe in your own grief history, you've experienced that yourself. Maybe for you, your grief process, the length or time of your bereavement has been contained to a part where you continue to grieve, but it's not as impactful, and that happens. But there's no timetable for people. There's no foolproof system to apply. Now, I know there are plenty of books out that you could read on grief and bereavement, and there are few that give you steps. And so you're supposed to go to this step and then the next step, and as if there is a natural progression for grief, and there is not. Prescribing steps for grief is assumptive, meaning everyone grieves differently. So you can't just apply this, and I'll use the term cookie cutter method, to your grief and somehow expect that by step 5 you're okay. That's not how it works. That's not how it works. And I think if we are the ones who want to come alongside a grieving friend, then we need to understand that we can't put them on some kind of a system, nor can we address it by looking at a book and trying to figure out where they are right now in their grieving process. Next slide. Now, here's where we get maybe a little bit controversial. Now, most of the information I'm taking is from a psychologist named Alan Wolfelt, and he has a practice out of Colorado. He travels around the country, and one of his mainstays in regard to counseling for grief and bereavement is the idea of maintaining a relationship with a deceased loved one. And some people think that that's pathological, meaning that there's something wrong with you and it needs to be addressed medically. And there's nothing wrong with maintaining a relationship. I can give you an example. We just celebrated Memorial Day. And we maintain a relationship with those men and women who have served our country and actually have died protecting the freedoms that we enjoy today. And so you have praise and you have memorial services in cemeteries. All those things are meant to maintain a connection because of the importance of the event and the sacrifices that those people made. That's the same thing with maintaining a relationship with a deceased loved one. When someone says that you have a relationship with someone who is no longer living, someone might think, well, you may need treatment, or you may need healing, or you may need a required number of therapy sessions. Now, you may, if you're suffering from complicated grieving, complicated mourning, but generally speaking, you don't. Next slide, please. Our society is uncomfortable with those who grieve. We all feel that way. Probably one of the most uncomfortable times is when we go to a funeral home where the family's having visitation. And so you're standing in line, as many do, to greet the family and to express your condolences. And while you're in line, you're nervous about what you should say. And you're thinking, what can I say? Can I mention the name of the deceased? And so we're uncomfortable with that because we don't know what to do. Alan Wolfelt says this: grief in contemporary society has been medicalized and perceived as if it is an illness that with proper assessment, diagnosis, and treatment, it can be cured. I have, and you probably too, numerous experiences of going to a funeral home and visiting with the family. And let me give you a bit of advice that I think has been very helpful. And you know that the individual that you may be speaking to, those who've lost loved ones, will feel very good about that. If you knew the individual well and you want to share your condolences with the family, always mention the individual by name. I have a good friend. His name was Tom. He was the chairman of a ministry that I headed, and we were fast friends as well. When he passed away unexpectedly, I was standing in the line like everyone else, and as I approached his wife, I didn't want to just say, oh, I'm sorry for your loss. I mean, Tom was a personal friend. So I mentioned how much I loved Tom, how much he meant in my life. And I can tell you that when we do things like that, when we mention the name of the deceased loved one, that encourages the family. Because oftentimes, again, I'll reflect on our Western society and values, oftentimes we tend to think that gone and forgotten. It's just a matter of time before you're healed and you're feeling better and all the things that you experienced before are gone. Let me share something that I call companioning the bereaved. This again is information that's taken from the book by the same title about Alan Wolfelt. Could I see the next slide, please? Again, another quote. Companioning the bereaved is not about assessing or analyzing, fixing or resolving another's grief. Instead, it is about being totally present to the mourner, even being a temporary guardian of her soul. Think about that. Now, I suspect that you're watching this presentation because you're either in the process of grieving, you've experienced grieving, you have a friend who is grieving now, and you want to help. And the idea of being a companion to the bereaved means that you come alongside them. And as you'll see as we go through the rest of this presentation, it's not to provide answers, it's not to make them feel better, it's just to be there. And I like what Dr. Wolfelt talks about, being a guardian of her soul. You're there as a sounding board. You're there as simply as a presence, helping them through their grief process. The first tenet, and there are 10, the first tenet of companioning the bereaved says this. Next slide, please. Number 1, companioning is about being present to another person's pain. It's not about taking away that pain. Grief is not shameful. It talks about the wisdom of the soul in regard to a relationship, and it's also part of what we call acknowledging our own suffering. You're not there to take away another person's pain. Now, I'm the kind of friend that wants to make you feel better. So if you're bothered by something, and I know about it, I'm going to come alongside you, and I'm going to console you. And I might try to console you by being lighthearted, or maybe telling a joke or something like that, thinking that by doing that, I'm going to take your mind off whatever is bothering you. Now, as a friend, you might give me the benefit of the doubt. You might even put up with me. But my job shouldn't be to somehow think that I'm going to have some kind of a formula that's going to take your pain away. No, my job there is to be present. Just to be present. Look at the second tenet. The second tenet is companion is about going to the wilderness of the soul with another human being. It is not about thinking you're responsible, finding the way out. Number 2, in companioning the bereaved. I love that when it talks about going to the wilderness of the soul with another human being. It is not thinking that you are responsible, finding the way out. Now that might seem kind of like really philosophically deep. But what it's talking about is that when you volunteer yourself to come alongside someone who's grieving, someone who is hurting, you're not to go there with preconceived expectations of how you're going to make a difference. Obviously, you do want to make a difference. Otherwise, you would not be there. But you're making a difference by just being alongside that individual. And it's not about guiding this individual through the wilderness of grief, through the valleys and through the deep parts of grieving. It's just, again, being there with them. It talks about the wilderness of grief, and they call it that because a wilderness is an unknown place. When you go out into the wilderness, sometimes you don't know where you are. And that's the idea in grief. Sometimes when someone begins their grieving process, they don't know where they are going. They are so consumed and even overwhelmed by the grief that they're experiencing that there's just no set path. Your job is to walk alongside them. Not necessarily saying, turn right or turn left or let's go straight ahead. Your job is just to walk with them and to encourage them. Talks about detachment and grief. Oftentimes when you see someone just detaching themselves from other people, that's something you can understand. Sometimes when we are grieving, we just want to be left alone. And that's okay. And sometimes you may need for a season to walk away from the individual that you want to be with, that you want alongside. And you need to understand that. But here's something important. Dr. Walford calls it surrendering to grief. And it's simply understanding that grief is a process and it's a necessary process and we should not push it away. Now, you might have known somebody or maybe you have done this yourself. When you're suffering from grief or anxiety, you get busy. You're thinking the busier I am, the better because it's going to take my mind off of my grief. It's going to take my mind off my anxiety, my worries. And that may be true temporarily, but what you're doing is that you're just postponing a necessary grieving process. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about going into the wilderness. Next slide, tenet number 3. It says companion is about honoring the spirit. It is not about focusing on the intellect. That simply means that not everything's going to make sense. Not everything's going to make sense. You know, when you talk about honoring the spirit, I would also say honoring the emotions in that way. Obviously, you want to be careful that the person that you're walking alongside doesn't want to hurt him or herself or say something that would be inappropriate or untimely or something that might cause more friction within the family. But at the same time, this is an emotional event, even a deep spiritual event. And so while we might want to try to figure it out, which is perfectly normal for every one of us, we want to figure it out. That's not the time for figuring it out. You accept what it is. You accept what it is and you go with it. And you respect the work of the soul. Now, Dr. Wolfram uses the term work of the soul simply that means the inner dimensions of the experience of the griever. Now, I'm sure as I go through this terminology, while it may not be familiar with you, I think you could relate to it. If you've lost a loved one or there's been a major event in your life that's been such a great disappointment, you've gone through these things. Oh, you might not have been able to put a tag on or a name on them, but you've gone through these things. And so while I'm speaking these things, you're probably thinking, I know what he's talking about. I couldn't express it, but that's exactly what I'm talking about. Respecting the work of the soul. Let's look at the next slide, number 4. Companioning's about listening with the heart. It's not about analyzing the head. I like that. I know in my limited experience of walking along someone who is grieving, I had a tendency to want to correct the individual for comments they made or things that they might express or even feelings that they had. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to correct them because it doesn't sound right or just doesn't fit together. It's about listening with the heart. And that's difficult. That's very difficult because what happens to us is that what we want to do is help. And what we want to do is fix. And even if we've never been involved in providing companionship to someone who is grieving, we still have an innate desire to fix what is wrong. It's like when you're raising your kids. And you know, we always wanted to have our children take responsibility for decisions they've made, even if they blow up in their face. But as a parent, if they get hurt, you want to fix it. You want to make everything right. You don't want them to suffer any hurt or pain or disappointment. And so as a parent, sometimes you try to overstep your bounds in a sense and take away the responsibility that our children ought to embrace themselves. And that's the same thing when you're working with someone who's grieving. You don't like to see them that way. It pains you to know that they're hurting, and so you're thinking, I can fix that. I can take care of that. And again, they're all good things that you want to do, motivations that are perfectly fine and reasonable and even worthwhile. But we don't want to take away by analyzing with our head what they're feeling with their heart. And so it requires humility. It requires what is called here unknowing, not necessarily knowing what the past is. It requires unconditional love and acceptance. You may be tempted, if you're walking along someone who is bereaved, you may be tempted to correct them. Like they may make a statement that you think is absurd, and you may want to blurt out a correction. Well, sometimes you just don't need to comment. You just don't need to comment. Even if they're wrong in their observation or their assessment of what they've just said, I think you have to put it in the context of where they are in their grief. And while in any other situation you would be correct in making an adjustment and making a correction, in a situation like this, it's best left alone. And it talks about a readiness to receive. And that works both ways. A readiness from those who are in grief to receive the process of grief in their lives and not reject it. It's also for those who are walking alongside as a companion to just receive all the ups and downs that will come with that. And it's oftentimes very difficult. Tenet number 5 in the next slide says this: companion is about bearing witness to the struggles of others. It's not about judging or directing their struggles. Again, much like trying to fix things or analyze with your head, here you are bearing witness to the struggle. You're playing a companion role. And so you're not directing this individual. You're walking alongside, bearing witness to the struggle that individual is going through. Now you might stop and think, well, yeah, that sounds pretty harsh. I mean, if I'm able to help someone in their grief, why would I just sit back and watch them suffer? Now, obviously, you need to assess that yourself in regard to the harm someone's experiencing and the way that you can help. But remember what we're talking about here. We're talking about an understanding of what grief is all about. And I started off the presentation with recognizing how misunderstood grief is, even within the medical community. Even within the medical community. because of our Western philosophy, our Western thought, our Western ways of doing things, anything that hinders progress, anything that stands in the way of moving forward is a negative. And certainly grief, in its most basic form, stops us in our tracks. And we don't like it. And we want to fix it. And so that's why they're talking about here, about bearing witness to the struggles of others and not judging or directing those struggles. For instance, if someone breaks it down and begins crying, it's not our responsibility to say, oh, please don't cry. Or if they say, well, you know, I just don't know what to do, and I don't know where to... It's not our responsibility to say, well, we'll figure this all out. Now, maybe you will figure it all out, and in the end, it will be figured out. But all I'm saying is it doesn't necessarily require an affirmation of you fixing something to help that person feeling better. Again, bearing witness, feeling, not fixing. Our next slide, slide 6, talks about companions, about walking alongside. It's not about leading or being led. Now, this is interesting. Walking alongside, beside someone, you think, well, how do we know where we're going if someone doesn't take the lead? I mean, isn't there an agreed upon pathway of which we want to take? My wife and I like to take walks with our grandchildren. And there are a number of parks in our area, and there's a path that we follow. And so we generally know we're walking alongside one another, but we're following the path. We're following the same path. And here's an interesting thing when we talk about that. A companion is about walking alongside, but it's not about leading or being led. So we don't have the responsibility to lead somebody through their grief struggles. But there again, when we talk about walking alongside, we then are not to be led either. And I can tell you, right, there's tension right there. There is some tension. Because you think, okay, I'm not going to lead, I understand that. But what if Jack wants to lead, and where are we going to go? So the idea is to stay alongside. There's a mutual respect there. There's sensitivity and warmth in a relationship. There's trust. There's humility. There's hope and heart. There's even humor. Now, I tend to use humor often in difficult situations, and I have one that I've shared before, and I don't know if I've shared it on this format, but I served as a pastor for 14 years in Grand Rapids, and one of my parishioners was dying, and I was at her apartment with her husband, and there was a visiting nurse with her, and I know this lady very well, and we would always joke at church and such. And she's sitting in a chair, laying her head back with her eyes closed, and I made kind of a silly statement. And with her eyes still closed, with the visiting nurse on one side, her husband on the other, and I'm kind of behind her head, she says to me, "And you call yourself a pastor?" And you know, we all laugh. Here she is within literally days of dying, and we just started laughing. And so, sometimes it's the acceptance of situations like that help in the grieving process. And so, yes, you can use humor as you're providing companionship to the bereaved. The next slide 7, says this: companioning means discovering the gifts of sacred silence. It does not mean filling up every moment with words. For most people, maybe I'll say many people, the idea of keeping one's mouth closed is really difficult. Because think of the situation here. You have placed yourself in an honorable position, a worthy position. You're going to walk alongside someone who's grieving. You want to provide companionship. And yet, this person who's grieving, in the midst of her grief, may say some things, may blurt out some things, or may just be quiet. And oftentimes, we do not like silence. We feel that silence has to be filled up with something. And Dr. Wolford talks about the gift of silence. Sometimes your presence, as we said in the beginning, your presence is enough. You don't have to engage them in a conversation. All they may want you to do is just be with them. And you don't need to say a thing. Another ministry experience, another ministry I headed before I pastored a church. I had a good friend who worked with the ministry, and he always loved to talk. So we would meet with prospective donors, and it was his job. It was his job to raise funds for the ministry. Yet he could never just pause. So we're sitting with a potential donor who's interested in providing funding for our ministry, and there was a pause in the conversation. And my friend jumped in to fill that time. He always wanted to jump in to fill the silence. Sometimes it's not necessary. Sometimes we will have what Dr. Wolford calls the gift of silence. As we look at these symptoms, as we look at the challenges that we face, we know, for instance, that we have a responsibility to come along someone. And that is a grave responsibility. As I said, it's an honorable and worthy responsibility. I share these, what we call tenets, to help us understand. I'm not going to say the do's and don'ts, because I don't want this to say, well, you can't do this and you're supposed to do that. This is just helping us to understand that it isn't necessary at times to have all the answers, to figure out all the things. On tenet number 8, the next slide, it says this: companion is about being still. It's not about frantic movement forward. Stillness and pain. I like to move. It's rare for me to be still. Even if I'm on vacation on a beach, I have to walk the beach. I can't sit on the beach. I have to be up and down, looking around, all these kinds of things. Here we're talking about being still. The Bible says, be still and know that I am God. What the Word of God is telling us is that sit down, rest, and listen. And that's what we're talking about here. Companion is about being still. It's not about frantic movement forward. Again, it goes back to sometimes who we are as citizens of the United States. We love progress. We always want to be moving ahead. We always want to be accomplishing things. And the idea of stillness, the idea of just sitting back and not doing anything, seems so counterproductive. And yet, when we make the application here in regard to companioning the bereaved, it is very, very productive. The idea of listening, the idea of being still, it's very productive in the grieving process as you come alongside. Tenet number 9, the next slide, says this: companioning is about respecting disorder and confusion. It's not about imposing order and logic. That is so true. I mentioned in the beginning that my father was killed unexpectedly on his way to work, broadsided by, of all things, a school bus. I was pastoring in Granville, Michigan at the time. I was the family pastor there, and I received a call from my oldest sister. Both my oldest sister and my brother lived in New Jersey, the southern part of New Jersey. My youngest sister lived in California, still does. And my oldest sister tells me about my dad being killed. Well, my youngest sister just remarried, and we had only met her husband one time. And so I didn't even have his phone number, his cell phone number. And I had to call my youngest sister to tell her that her dad, she being the baby of the family, and she always thought the favorite, that her dad was killed. I'll never forget calling her. And she was in her office, and she started screaming. I mean, screaming. And she was the manager of human resource for her company, and I could hear people running in saying, Noreen, what's the trouble? What's happening? And she was just screaming. I'll never forget that. There was plenty of disorder and confusion at that time. And for my youngest sister being so far away, it was just amplified because she could not be there with the family. Obviously, of course, we gathered together as things were put together for my father's memorial service. But don't think that you have to pull things together and make some orderly fashion of what's going on. I know, even if you're a neatnik, it's difficult to see disorder. But when it comes to something as emotional, as deep, and I'll say, as soul-stirring as grief and bereavement, allow for disorder, allow for confusion. Now, you'll see more disorder and confusion in the beginning stages of grief and bereavement, like I did with my family, with my youngest sister, with the announcement of my father's death. Eventually, it kind of settles down a bit. It might have its ups and downs, but usually the beginning is the order of disorder. It's good just to allow it to happen. Just to allow it to happen. That's where you come in as a most valuable asset for the individual that you're walking alongside. Because as you observe the disorder and confusion, you remain calm, you remain supportive, and that individual, while they may not be really conscious of your presence for the moment, they'll know that you were there during the most difficult and trying times in their lives. Finally, tenet number 10. The next slide reads this. Companioning is about learning from others. It's not about teaching them. We are students when we walk along someone who is grieving. If this would be the first time that you've done such a thing, it's like a PhD course in grief and bereavement. The things that you'll be experiencing, the things that you'll be seeing. But that's good. That's good because the next time you volunteer to walk alongside, you'll have a deeper and more intimate understanding of the things that you're seeing, the things that you're experiencing, the things that you're hearing, and you'll be even that much better a companion. That's why support groups and stories are so important. For someone who is grieving in the midst of bereavement, a support group is very helpful because you have other people who have experienced grief and bereavement and they're able to share their stories. But even if you experience the same type of grief, say the loss of a loved one, that doesn't necessarily mean that you totally understand the individual's own grief. Because we all grieve differently. We all grieve differently. A related story of my dad's death. The day that my dad was killed was also the day that a parent from our Christian school who died of cancer was having the visitation. And the visitation was being done at our school. And the woman who died had teenage children, one of which was 15 years old, the same age that I was when my mother died. Everyone knew about my father's death because my wife was a secretary at the school. And so when I told her, the news went all through the school. Yet we went to that visitation that evening, although my dad had died that very day. And the family knew that. And when I went up to take hold of the hands of the 15-year-old girl who just lost her mother, I didn't say to her, I know exactly how you feel. Just because I was 15 and lost my mother at the same age, it didn't necessarily mean that I knew how she felt, because we all grieve differently. But I did say this. I said to her, I lost my mother when I was 15. And I know that probably helped her to know that there was someone who just came up to pay respects to her and her family who experienced the loss of a parent as a young teen. I tell you those things because oftentimes we try to kind of infuse our own experiences in with others, and that's not a bad thing, and we do it with good intentions. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we have an understanding of what that person's going through, because grief is also a matter of one's personality as well. If you're very, very high strung and always all over the place, then you're going to be much more expressive in your grief. But if you're much quieter and more reserved, you won't necessarily express it in the same way, nor will the impact be the same thing. Grief and bereavement. The last one here is number 11. Companion's about curiosity. It's not about expertise. This is where the value of a novice comes in and is so valuable. I say that meaning that if you come along someone who is grieving, who's in the throes of bereavement, and you have never, ever done anything like this before, that's a really good thing. And I'm not being flippant about that. If you were to follow these tenets, keeping in mind that the main responsibility you have is to be a companion, then you're not going to come in with all this information or assume that you have this expertise. And you're going to find yourself providing so much more help than if somehow you had a master's degree in a particular bereavement discourse and you think you're going to bring that and be used. It doesn't mean you can't be helpful, but oftentimes the lack of expertise is very valuable. My last slide is called Companion as a Reflection of Love. It says this: the experience of grief is very powerful. As we encounter personal loss in our lives, we have the opportunity to make a willful choice of how we're going to use the pain of grief, whether we're going to channel it to make our lives better or worse. You know, it's pretty easy for me to stand up here and say, well, this is how you're supposed to do it, and this is how you're supposed to feel. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that. All I'm providing for you and for myself as a reminder is that companioning the bereaved is a reflection of love. It's you sacrificing your time and even, I'll say, your emotions and your schedule to come alongside and just walk. Just walk. And every grief walk is going to be different. For some, it will be a brief stroll, not too tense, not too difficult, and they go through a grieving process and come out on the other side. For others, it could be a circular walk that for you as the companion, you'll find confusing. But either way, a walk in the park or a walk through the wilderness is still a reflection of love. So let me say this as a challenge and as a closing portion of this presentation. If you're grieving now, I would look for someone that you know, love, and respect and ask them to walk alongside you. Just with the things that you heard today and that you could review on your own, think about that. Don't push yourself. Don't think that there's something wrong with you if you continue to grieve and you've been grieving for quite some time. Because I can say this, you will never stop grieving. Your life will change and you have to make the necessary adjustments. But you'll never forget. There's no such thing as out of sight, out of mind. But if you are at the other side, that you are a friend of someone who is grieving, again, I would encourage you to come alongside. And don't offer or say, I'm going to help you with this. Just say, I would like to walk alongside your journey. May I? And allow that relationship to bring encouragement and even healing to one who's grieving. So thank you so much for your participation here, walking alongside the brokenhearted. If you have any questions, I know that you could, again, take a look at the handout that I'm using here, review it, and I would hope that you would take on that responsibility. And if you're grieving, look for someone who would walk alongside you.